Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d6. Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn g7 to g6. Knight b1 to c3. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn f2 to f4. Bishop f8 to g7. Knight g1 to f3. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn d4 takes c5. Queen d8 to a5. Queen d1 to d4. Pawn d6 takes c5. Bishop f1 to b5, check. Knight b8 to d7. Queen d4 to a4. Queen a5 to b4. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d5. Pawn a2 to a3. Knight d5 takes c3. Bishop b5 takes d7, check. Bishop c8 takes d7. Queen a4 takes d7, check. King e8 takes d7. Pawn a3 takes b4. Knight c3 to e4. Pawn b4 takes c5. Knight e4 takes c5. Bishop c1 to e3. Rook h8 to c8. Castle kingside. King d7 to e8. Rook a1 to a3. Pawn a7 to a6. Knight f3 to d4. Pawn g6 to g5. Rook f1 to a1. Knight c5 to d7. Rook a3 to b3. Pawn b7 to b5. Pawn g2 to g3. Pawn g5 takes f4. Pawn g3 takes f4. Pawn f7 to f6. Pawn e5 to e6. Knight d7 to c5. Rook b3 to b4. Knight c5 to b7. Pawn c2 to c4. Rook c8 takes c4. Rook b4 takes b5. Knight b7 to d8. Rook b5 to h5. Pawn f6 to f5. Rook h5 takes h7. Bishop g7 takes d4. Bishop e3 takes d4. Knight d8 takes e6. Rook h7 to h8, check. Knight e6 to f8. Bishop d4 to g7. King e8 to f7. Bishop g7 to h6. Rook c4 to c2. Rook a1 to a5. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn b2 to b4. Rook c2 to c1, check. King g1 to f2. Rook c1 to c2, check. King f2 to e3. Rook c2 takes h2. Rook a5 to c5. Rook h2 to h3, check. King e3 to f2. Knight f8 to d7. Rook h8 takes a8. Knight d7 takes c5. Pawn b4 takes c5. Rook h3 takes h6. Pawn c5 to c6. Rook h6 to h2, check. King f2 to e3. Rook h2 to c2. Rook a8 takes a6. King f7 to e7. King e3 to d4. Rook c2 to c1. Rook a6 to b6. King e7 to d6. Pawn c6 to c7, check. King d6 to e7. Rook b6 to b7. Rook c1 to d1, check. King d4 to c5. King e7 to d7. Pawn c7 to c8, promoting to queen, check. King d7 takes c8. Rook b7 to a7. Rook d1 to f1. King c5 to c6. King c8 to d8. King c6 to d6. Rook f1 to d1, check. King d6 to a5. King d8 takes e7, the game is a draw.